August the 8th, 1944. A wheat field outside the village of Saint-Aignan-de-Cramesnil, south of Caen. The grain is chest-high and the morning is already warm, the kind of close, hazy heat that sits over Normandy in high summer. Somewhere in that field, a line of Allied tanks is waiting, engines idling low, crews watching a tree line 400 yards away through periscopes smeared with dust. Within the next few minutes, one of Germany's most feared tank commanders will be dead, along with his crew, killed by a gun that, 18 months earlier, the British Army's own procurement officers had tried to cancel. Here is the anomaly. By every conventional measure, the tank carrying that gun should not have been able to win this fight. It was built on the chassis of the M4 Sherman, a tank German crews had nicknamed, half-mockingly, for how quickly it caught fire. It had thinner armor than the vehicle it was about to destroy. Its turret ring had never been designed for the weapon now crammed inside it. And the only reason it was on that battlefield at all was that a handful of British engineers had spent much of 1943 modifying a tank behind the backs of officers who thought the project unnecessary, expensive, and faintly ridiculous. For more incredible true stories from World War II, carefully researched and brought to life, subscribe to the channel and never miss a new documentary. This is not really a story about one field in Normandy, or even about one tank commander's death. This is a story about what happens when an army realizes, too late, that it has sent its soldiers to fight with the wrong tool, and about the unglamorous, half-improvised engineering scramble it takes to fix that mistake in time for it to matter. To understand why the Sherman needed fixing at all, you have to go back to what the tank was actually built to do. The M4 Sherman was designed in the United States in 1941 and 1942 around a straightforward doctrinal idea. Tanks existed primarily to support infantry and exploit breakthroughs, while dedicated tank destroyers would handle enemy armor. It was reliable, mechanically simple, easy to mass produce, and armed with a 75mm gun that was perfectly adequate against the German tanks it was expected to meet, the Panzer III and the early Panzer IV. The trouble is that by the time Allied planners were finalizing the invasion of Normandy, Germany's tank fleet had changed. The Tiger I had entered service in 1942, followed by the Panther in 1943, both carrying frontal armor and guns that outclassed almost everything the Western Allies could field. A Sherman's 75mm shell, fired at a Tiger's front glacis plate at anything like normal combat range, would very often simply fail to penetrate. Bounce off. British and American planners knew this well before D-Day. Intelligence reports through 1943 had already flagged the growing gap. And here's the small question worth holding on to for later. If the problem was known that early, why did so many tank crews go into Normandy in June of 1944, still riding in tanks that couldn't reliably kill the German armor waiting for them? The honest answer involves industrial capacity, inter-Allied politics, and a British gun nobody in authority particularly wanted to marry to an American tank. We'll come back to that marriage, because it very nearly didn't happen. For more incredible true stories from World War II, carefully researched and brought to life, subscribe to the channel and never miss a new documentary. The gun in question was the Ordnance quick-firing 17-pounder, a British anti-tank weapon developed earlier in the war and already proven, by 1943, as one of the most effective tank-killing guns in Allied service, mounted in towed anti-tank batteries, and eventually in Britain's own Challenger and Cromwell-derived designs, the 17-pounder could punch through armor the standard Sherman gun couldn't touch. The obvious question, then, was why not put it in a Sherman? The obvious answer was that nobody had built the Sherman to take it. The 17-pounder was longer, heavier at the breech, and produced far more recoil than the turret ring and mounting had ever been engineered for. British designers, a small team working largely at the Department of Tank Design, with a Royal Artillery officer named George Brighty among those pushing the concept forward through 1943, had to redesign the mounting, rotate the breech 90 degrees so it could actually fit and be worked inside the turret, cut a hole in the back of the turret for an ammunition loading hatch the original Sherman never had, and rebalance a vehicle that was now carrying a gun roughly 1.5 feet longer than the barrel it replaced. None of this had official enthusiasm behind it at first. Senior figures within Britain's tank establishment were, by most accounts, skeptical. Britain was already committed to producing thousands of standard Shermans under Lend-Lease arrangements, and reworking them individually looked, on paper, like a wasteful diversion of scarce engineering effort. The project survived largely because a handful of officers and engineers kept pressing it forward on the strength of firing trials that were, frankly, hard to argue with. Hold that detail. The fact that this weapon almost didn't happen, because it becomes the quiet irony sitting underneath everything that follows. By January 1944, trials had convinced enough of the doubters. The modified tank was approved for production and given a name that stuck immediately: Firefly. Before we get into what the Firefly actually did on the battlefield, and there's a specific piece of German tactical doctrine coming up that most people have never heard of, it's worth saying, if you're finding this kind of detail interesting, this channel goes into the mechanics behind British armor and tank warfare in exactly this depth, so it's worth sticking around for what's coming. Back to Normandy. Because production capacity for the 17-pounder and its specialized ammunition was limited, Britain could not convert every Sherman in its inventory. The compromise was a ratio. Within most armored regiments, only one tank in a troop of 4 was a Firefly. The other 3 kept their standard 75mm guns. In practice, this meant that 3/4 of any given British or Commonwealth tank troop still could not reliably kill a Tiger or Panther head-on. They depended on that 4th tank to do it for them. German tank crews figured this out with unsettling speed. Within weeks of the Normandy landings, German gunners had learned to identify the Firefly at a glance by its unusually long gun barrel, and multiple post-war accounts describe standing instructions, at least informally circulated among some units, to prioritize destroying the Firefly in any troop before engaging the other tanks. The vehicle built to be Britain's answer to the Tiger had, almost immediately, become the single most hunted tank on the Allied side of the field. The British response to being hunted was almost embarrassingly practical. Crews began disguising their own tanks. Painted false muzzle sections, sometimes made from wood or canvas, were fitted partway down the barrel to break up its silhouette and make the gun look shorter, more like the ordinary 75mm Sherman from a distance. Some crews repainted the barrel in mottled patterns for the same reason. It was a low-tech countermeasure to a very modern problem, an army trying to hide its best anti-tank weapon by making it look worse than it was. For more incredible true stories from World War II, carefully researched and brought to life, subscribe to the channel and never miss a new documentary. Now hold on to that number I mentioned earlier, 1 Firefly in every 4 tanks, because it's about to collide with the most surprising statistic in this whole story. Despite that scarcity, wartime analysis and post-war tank versus tank studies consistently identify the 17-pounder Firefly as responsible for a share of German tank kills wildly disproportionate to how few of them there actually were on the battlefield. In many analyses of Normandy tank engagements, Fireflies, never more than 1/4 of British tank strength in any troop, and often less across a whole squadron once losses and repairs are factored in, accounted for what some studies suggest was close to half of the German tanks destroyed by British armor in the campaign. 1 tank in 4 was doing the disproportionate share of the killing. That brings us to August the 8th and the wheat field outside Saint-Aignan-de-Cramesnil during the opening phase of Operation Totalize. A column of Tiger tanks from the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion moved to counter the Allied advance. Among them, the Tiger commanded by Michael Wittmann, by that point one of the most publicized tank aces in the German army, credited with well over 100 confirmed tank kills across the Eastern Front and earlier fighting in Normandy. His Tiger was destroyed in that engagement, along with the rest of his crew. Exactly which Allied unit fired the fatal shot has been argued over for decades, since Firefly crews of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry have the strongest and most commonly cited claim, though rocket-firing Typhoon aircraft operating in the area that morning have also been credited by some historians, and the precise sequence of who engaged Wittmann's Tiger and in what order has never been settled with complete certainty. What is not disputed is that at least one Firefly from a British armored regiment was firing 17-pounder rounds into German armor in that field within minutes of Wittmann's death. Here's the part that matters, though, and it's not really about who gets credit for one famous kill. It's about what that engagement represents. A tank Britain's own officers had nearly shelved as an unnecessary complication had, within 2 months of D-Day, become the vehicle credited, rightly or by circumstance, with the death of Germany's most famous panzer commander. The popular image of Normandy tank warfare, the one that dominated post-war memory for decades, was of hopelessly outgunned Allied crews riding thin-skinned Shermans to their deaths against German armor they had no answer to. That image isn't wrong, exactly, but it's incomplete, and it undersells what the 17-pounder conversion actually achieved once it reached the field in numbers. It's worth being honest, though, about where that corrected picture itself needs correcting, because the Firefly's success story has its own blind spot. British planners were slow, arguably too slow, to recognize before Normandy how urgently this weapon was needed, and slower still to scale its production once its effectiveness was proven. Even after Totalize, even after the kill ratios started coming in, Fireflies remained a minority of the tank fleet right through to the end of the war in Europe, never issued in the numbers frontline commanders were actually requesting. Some armored regiments went into major engagements with Firefly numbers well below even the official 1 in 4 establishment, because production and conversion simply couldn't keep pace with losses and demand. The tank that arguably did the most disproportionate killing on the British side of the Normandy campaign was, for its entire operational life, chronically undersupplied relative to what the battlefield actually called for. Getting the gun right was only half the story. Getting enough of them to the front on time was the part Britain never fully solved. For more incredible true stories from World War II, carefully researched and brought to life, subscribe to the channel and never miss a new documentary. And underneath all of this, the production numbers, the kill ratios, the arguments over who fired the shot that killed Wittmann, there were ordinary crews doing an extraordinarily dangerous job. A Firefly gunner and loader worked in a turret that had been retrofitted around them rather than built for them from the start, cramped further by a breech that took up more space than the tank was ever meant to spare, in a vehicle every German tank crew in the sector had been told, one way or another, to kill first. Survival rates for tank crews in Normandy were grim across the board. For the men crewing the tank the enemy was actively hunting, the margins were thinner still. So return to that wheat field. A tank Britain had almost declined to build, crewed by men riding in a turret retrofitted around a gun it was never designed to carry, may have fired the shot that ended the career of Germany's most famous tank commander. And even now, more than 80 years on, historians still can't say with total certainty whose shell it actually was. That uncertainty is, in its own way, the truest thing about this story. The Firefly was never a triumphant, fully resourced answer to the Tiger. It was a compromise, built late, supplied thin, disguised in the field with wooden false muzzles because there weren't enough real ones to go around, and it still, by most tallies, outkilled its own numbers by a wide margin. Britain didn't solve the Tiger problem cleanly. It solved it just well enough, just barely in time, and asked one tank in 4 to carry the weight of the other 3. A tank built almost as an afterthought ended up doing the work an entire army had been counting on it to do. There's another story sitting right next to this one about the towed 17-pounder batteries that did the same job from static positions and paid an even steeper price for it. And that's one for another video. If this kind of detail on British armor and tank development is what you come here for, you know what to do. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.